I recently posted a video entitled 10 Reasons Why You Should Never Buy an EV, linked in the description. Go and watch that, when you've finished watching this one of course, which summarises the reasons on the demand side of the equation as to why the average person should not even consider an EV. Cost, convenience, practicality and depreciation are just some of them. If you really want to do your bit for the planet, rather than just signal your virtue to the neighbours, buy a recent used combustion car, maintain it well and keep it as long as possible. But on the other side of the equation, there are almost as many reasons why the great EV transition that the evangelists are always crowing on about will never happen. We're going to look at a great video with Mark P. Mills, which again you should watch in full after this, and extract 11 key reasons why battery EVs won't replace combustion cars anytime soon. And there's nothing in here about politics or opinion. It simply exposes how the fantasy policies of governments will collide with reality, engineering and physics. And it doesn't take a genius to work out which of those will win out in the end. Welcome back to MGUY, British engineer and lawyer, now Sydney YouTuber. I'm closing in on 100k subscribers, which is absolutely amazing. So if you're one of the majority of my viewers who are not subscribed to this channel, please just click that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you'd like to make a contribution to the channel, why not buy me a coffee? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. From his bio, Mark P. Mills is a distinguished senior fellow at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a contributing editor at the City Journal, a faculty fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering, director of the National Center on Energy Analytics, and co-founding partner in Montrose Lane, an energy fund. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. In this video, given in November at Hillsdale College, Michigan, he explains why EV mandates are all about removing personal freedoms rather than reducing emissions. But we don't need to worry, because they'll never work anyway. Let's get into it. Number 1. EVs don't reduce oil use. Ignoring the fact that the fantasy policy of net zero fails to appreciate that oil is used for thousands of other products that we rely on in our daily lives, banning combustion cars will make virtually zero difference to global energy consumption.
If it were the case that half of all the world's vehicles were electrically propelled, burn no oil, which is a goal that's functionally impossible to achieve in the remotely foreseeable future. But even if that were to happen, and by the way, half of all the world's vehicles becoming EVs is 100-fold growth of where we are today. It's a lot of growth. But even were that to happen, it would reduce the world's need for oil by about 10%. This is not an existential threat to big oil. Meanwhile, what's actually happening, consider these facts, that even as the number of EVs has risen, and it has, from nearly zero about a decade ago, to more than 40 million EVs in the world now, that is, all electric vehicles. And that's a big number. 40 million is a significant number of all electric vehicles. But that didn't stop the growth in the consumption of gasoline. This year, gasoline consumption globally is reaching record peaks, blowing past the peak gasoline consumption that took place just prior to the great and feckless lockdowns from COVID.
Number 2. EVs don't reduce CO2 emissions. This is why we're being forced into driving EVs, according to our governments. But it's all a lie.
The International Energy Agency's accounting bragged in their most recent report that globally EVs are already avoiding 150 megatons of CO2 emissions. Sounds like a big number. Well, you could do the math on this. That's about 0.4% of global CO2 emissions. Not such a big number. Or maybe for context, in a more sort of, in a way, grotesque way, the oil-burning war machines that are rampaging across Ukraine right now, those machines are emitting more new CO2 every 6 months than all the world's EVs combined have eliminated.
Number 3. The mining for EVs emits more CO2 than they save. It's easy to tell how much CO2 emissions are generated by combustion cars because you can simply look at the amount of diesel or petrol they burn, and that is directly related to the amount of CO2. But with EVs, nobody really knows, because the production and manufacture of these vehicles creates an enormous carbon footprint that is almost impossible to quantify.
And it rises from a really simple fact. A typical EV battery Dominic's parents, Tesla, has a 1,000-pound battery. The fuel tank weighs 1,000 pounds. The gasoline fuel tank in your car, if you drive a gasoline car, is about 80 pounds. That 1,000-pound fuel tank is made from a complex set of chemicals and minerals that require mining somewhere. In fact, for that 1,000-pound battery, you have to mine somewhere in the world 500,000 pounds of rock. Those 500,000 pounds of rock per car are mined with oil-burning machines, really big machines burning diesel fuel. They're carried by really big diesel fuel burning machines, shipped on ships burning diesel fuel all over the world, crushed by large coal-fired electric producing power plants and big grinders to crush the rock, to dissolve it, to get the minerals up. The list goes on. You get the point. Each car emits carbon dioxide emissions just to make it. Those emissions, what they are specifically, is highly difficult and complex to figure out because of the labyrinthian supply chains. There are global supply chains. Much of the supply chain is in China. So we actually don't know precisely what any particular EV's emissions are, but we do know the range, and it can vary by a factor of 300%. And at the higher end of the range, the emissions associated with it building the EV are greater than the emissions that you will save by never driving the gasoline car you turned in for the EV.
Number 4. EVs are just as complex as combustion cars. One of the biggest lies spun by EV proponents is that they are so much simpler than combustion cars, so eventually they will be so much cheaper, and then we won't need any government mandates or subsidies. This is simply not true. They are just differently complex.
A conventional car has a fairly complicated thermomechanical engine made of hundreds of parts and a very simple fuel tank with one part fuel pump. The EV swaps the complexity. The drivetrain is a very simple electric motor with one or two parts. The fuel tank is a battery with thousands of parts, thousands of welds, a cooling system, a structural system, power electronics, and safety systems. It's a very complex electrochemical machine that also wears out, is difficult to make. It is not simpler, it is, as I said, differently complex, like it's differently complicated. So it shouldn't be surprising if I tell you that despite the claims around the automotive strike where the workers were worried that they were losing their jobs because we were told the EVs are simpler, taking away labor, that's not true. EV labor is not less than conventional vehicle labor. The labor just shifts, like the complexity, to different places and different people. That's what the strike was about. In fact, the EV supply chain overall requires slightly more labor hours to make an EV than to make a conventional car. More, not less. It's just labor elsewhere.
Number 5. There are not enough minerals being mined. This is where things get very interesting because, as we've just heard, 500,000 pounds of earth and rock, or 250 tonnes, has to be moved and processed to make one EV battery. And the amount of elements and minerals required far exceeds our current capacity to mine them. And the lead times to open new mines is far greater than the ridiculous 5-year targets to ban combustion cars.
The fundamental challenge EVs have is that the vision of massive global forced EV rollout will require increase in the mining of critical minerals like copper and nickel and aluminum and manganese and lithium, of course. You notice I didn't say anything about rare earth metals. Those two, they're not rare, by the way. They have rare properties, and they are more commonly mined in China because we gave up that market 25 or 30 years ago. We drove it out of business because of the U.S. EPA. But to meet the goals of building as many EVs as are imagined by the policymakers who are forcing the subsidies and the mandates into the system, to meet those goals will require an increase in global mining of these metals of 400 to 7,000%. Even the International Energy Agency, which is an advocate of this path, the all-EV path, even they have pointed out repeatedly that the world is not now mining enough of those metals, is not planning to mine enough of those metals, has no plans to mine that many metals of any kind, and further, by their own analysis, it takes 10 to 16 years to open a net new mine. And we're having goals 10 years from now that will require us to increase mining by 400 to 7,000% with mines that we can't build for the next 10 to 16 years. These are, to say the obvious, maybe the most polite thing to say about it is they're incommensurate goals. I guess a simpler word for it in honor of Peanut is that they're nuts.
Number 6, EVs will get more expensive, not cheaper. The result of the demand for minerals and metals exceeding by many times the amount being produced will be reflected in the prices, which will go through the roof, meaning EVs will not be cheaper as time goes on, but will actually get more expensive. Just another lie of the evangelists, thoroughly debunked.
The mere pursuit, whether by fiat or subsidy, the mere pursuit of the goals to get that much more material mined out of the earth and put into machines like electric vehicles, but also windmills and solar panels, they also require this massive increase in mining. The mere pursuit of that at a time when there aren't enough materials being produced, this is economics 101, and I'm sure it's taught at Hillsdale. If you have that much demand pressure with limited supply, you get massive price escalation. Of course, that makes a lie of the claim that these vehicles are going to become inevitably cheaper. They will become inevitably more expensive if we keep pushing harder to force the manufacturing system to acquire that many materials that aren't available.
Number 7, EV charging infrastructure is expensive and complex. And here we're not talking about the chargers themselves or the power plants that generate the electricity. We're talking about the infrastructure required to get the electricity from one to the other, the equivalent of the pipes and tankers that currently transport petrol and diesel. And the figures are mind-blowing.
You can't see electricity. It's ethereal. It's got to be easy to move. Gasoline, you can see, it's heavy, got to pump it. But it's roughly 5 to 10 times more expensive to move a unit of energy as electricity than the same unit of energy as gasoline. It costs more in the hardware. It costs more capital to move energy in electron form, amazingly, than it does in the form of gasoline. The effect of that means that if I wanted to move the same amount of energy that goes through pipes, tanks, and trucks, and move that quantity of energy into wires and transformers, we know exactly what that would cost because we've been doing this for a very long time. We've been moving energy that way for a century. We know what the equipment costs. There's no magic. There's no mystery. The question you'd want to know is, first of all, is how much will that cost to swap out the tanks, pumps, and trucks for wires and transformers? Not for the power plants to make the electricity, not for the ignominious failures on deploying $7 billion worth of chargers to build a half dozen chargers, not that. The in-between stuff. The answer is about $3 trillion. That was the earlier $3 trillion I told you about that gets induced into the system.
Number 8, EVs will always be in a minority. I've always said that there is a limited use case for EVs for those with off-street parking and the ability to charge, and to reduce pollution in city centres. But for most people, they don't make sense. And I love the analogy Mark uses here.
Look, there's still a very good chance that EVs will become popular enough to rival, think about this, on a per capita basis in the United States, they'll rival the popularity on a per capita basis of horses circa 1900. If you look at the data, that's about where we'll get. Now, of course, there's a lot more cars than there were horses today because, well, the reason there's a lot more cars than horses is an interesting economic fact. Think of it this way. The average priced car in the United States requires about 10 weeks of the average income to buy. The average priced horse and buggy in the late 1800s required 10 years of the average wage of that time. That's why there's lots of cars.
Number 9, it's not about reducing emissions. There are many ways of reducing emissions that don't require a blanket EV mandate. More efficient petrol engines would have a far greater effect than forcing people to buy EVs.
Who would you subsidize? Well, rather than subsidize the wealthy who drive EVs, taxing the middle class, if we're going to subsidize somebody, why don't we subsidize the lower income drivers who drive long distances? These are called super users. Super users of gasoline constitute 10% of drivers and use 30% of all the gasoline in the United States. An obvious target, a high leverage target, and these tend to be the people that don't get subsidies. These tend to be the people that mow the lawns in Silicon Valley and drive their F-150s 80 or 90 miles to work and have to drive home.
Number 10. The goal is to take away your car. The real reason for all this isn't about saving the planet, however. It's all about taking away your car and your freedom.
The IEA's net zero plan, this is the plan to get carbon dioxide down, explicitly calls for increasing, I love the use of the reversal of this language, increasing the share of people who don't have a car. Notice how they want to increase the share of the homeowners in the world who don't have a car from today's 45%. So 45% of people in the world don't have a car. They want to increase that share to 70% of people not having a car by 2040 in order to meet their emissions goals. California, which is always, really eager to be on the leading edge of these kinds of dystopian trends, they've also explicitly stated that, and in their enshrined goals passed into law, they are going to require citizens in the near future to drive 25% fewer miles a year, 25% fewer miles a year than they did 30 years ago. That's going to be the benchmark for reducing driving.
Number 11. You can't change human nature. This is the biggest reason why these EV mandates are doomed to fail. You cannot change human nature.
Oh, and the trope that we'll all share the cars together, nobody wants to own their private car. First, there's no trends like that anywhere in history. That's why the United States now has more cars than there are licensed drivers. Why do you need 3 cars? You can't drive 3 cars at once. Why do you own a personal car? Why don't you just share them all? Because we're human beings. We want our own stuff. And the geniuses that want to plan the future think human nature will change. Human nature isn't going to change.
Well, there's plenty more in this video, and I strongly suggest you go and watch the full version at the link. But any one of these reasons should be enough to put a stop to the EV mandate madness. One of the points I didn't cover is that as soon as you mandate something, you're essentially locking in technology which rapidly becomes obsolete, and which would have been superseded by innovation had the market been allowed to do so. We're back to the compact fluorescent light debacle again. But the key takeaway is that the fantasy policies of governments cannot compete with the physical and engineering realities of battery electric vehicles. And I'm glad to say that this will ensure that they never become the dominant form of transport, and the so-called EV transition will never happen.